Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I am a software engineer at Doximity. It is a privilege to get to speak at RubyConf this year, and it's a significant milestone for me. My first RubyConf was in Cincinnati in 2016, and at that RubyConf, Doximity had a booth there. It was the place where I first learned about Doximity. I got to meet a lot of their engineers who were manning the booth, and they were really friendly and intelligent and left a good impression on me. At the time, I was working at a different company, but 2 years later, when I was job searching, um, Doximity came immediately to mind. And the great thing is, now 5 years later, obviously I work here, but I also still work with many of the people that I met that day. And I think that really speaks to the strength of the company and our engineering culture here. And now I have come full circle because Doximity has given me the opportunity to speak here at RubyConf and share a little bit of what I've learned with my time here. So today I'm going to talk about how to automate your API documentation using Rswag. But first, let's talk for a second about documentation. You probably already know this, but documentation is important. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, having struggled with, undocumented solutions or undocumented problems where I'm struggling through trying to fix like a bug or some error that keeps happening. No amount of Google foo is going to find an answer for this, and I really have to dig in and find out, what's going on underneath the hood. So I know the value of having an answer quickly at hand for a problem like that. Stack Overflow is a great example of this. When I have a problem, Stack Overflow always has the answer because it's documented. It has been written down so that the generations that follow in our footsteps will know how to fix that N+1 issue or just exit Vim. Good documentation provides the critical information people need to work effectively at their jobs. So the more you write down about these processes or hard lessons that you've learned, it increases the efficiency and effectiveness of the peers around you. And in the case of APIs, it's even more critical. The documentation you write for your API reflects how your application operates. And if your documentation sucks, your application is going to suck. It doesn't matter how great the code is. It just will be so difficult to adopt. And you know it because you have been there. You know that there's that one gem or that one library that is poorly documented and you just don't like using it. And because it's so hard to get it to do what you need it to do because it's just a big black box and you have to dig into the code to see what it's even doing. So without documentation, your product is just unusable. So let me talk about a common situation. And this is the problem we were running into, and it's a situation I've seen very commonly throughout my career. You have your code base. It's this majestic application that has all sorts of amazing features. It can solve all sorts of problems. It's efficient, it's scalable, it's easy to maintain. All of your web devs that work on this application love working on it because the code is so great. And then there's your documentation. And your documentation is totally isolated, all out on its own. There's no connection between the code or the documentation. They know nothing about each other. The only thing that keeps that documentation in your application in sync is you, the engineer. You are the only thing holding this together. The success of the product depends on you. And that's a lot of pressure because documentation is hard. With a human being the catalyst for our documentation, it will end up having the same flaws we have as humans. It'll have inaccuracies, it'll become out of date, and it'll be hard to understand. And even more so, just because of the limitations we have around writing this documentation. So that's where Rswag comes in and what I'm going to talk about today. So first, to give you a quick agenda, I'm just going to get into a little bit of background about our problem, the struggles that we had been going through, and talk a little bit about our team just to get you an idea of where we're coming from. Then we're going to look at what is Rswag and get to see Rswag in action. So let's get into it. First is background. So Doximity, if you don't know who we are a professional medical network for physicians. We have over 1.9 million users, and over 80% of all US doctors are on our platform. Doctors use our platform to network with other medical professionals. They keep up on the latest medical news. We have a newsfeed team, make telehealth calls as well on the telehealth team, and so much more. We've got tons of more products. I work on our telehealth team. We handle millions of telehealth calls, voice and video, per week from hundreds of thousands of medical professionals. So some of our products look like a voice feature. So we have this on mobile and we have it on desktop where physicians can call their patients from our application. They can also do video calls, and they can also send secure text messages to their patients from our platform. And so with being both mobile and desktop friendly, we have a variety of platforms on our team. Our team is comprised of Ruby on Rails developers, Vue engineers, and iOS and Android developers. And the Ruby on Rails developers are just web devs, what I'm going to call them throughout the rest of the talk. We handle the backend API, and the backend API is critical for handling all of these features. It houses all of the data. It provides that for the mobile clients and the Vue front end. If you want to start a telehealth call, send secure text messages to patients, everything in between, you've got to have the backend to do it, which means our documentation is absolutely critical. It has to be accurate and it has to be up to date in order for these other engineers to be able to do their job well. Thankfully, our mobile engineers were honest enough to tell us that our documentation sucked. And the struggle was not just on the mobile side, it was on the web dev side too. From the web dev perspective, writing this documentation was not a good experience. It was hard to get things to render. It was hard to even figure out the syntax that needed to use to write this documentation to begin with, because the tool we were using was itself not well documented. It was easy to break without knowing. So you could ship some document changes, think they work, nothing to indicate to you otherwise that didn't. And then it was also easy to forget to update after endpoint tweets, especially when you're in the heat of the moment trying to get a feature out really quickly. Documentation just falls to the side. And then on the mobile dev side, of course, it was even worse because we weren't producing good documentation. What they were getting was insufficient or late documentation because we would put it off, or they'd get inaccurate documentation because, again, getting back to those human qualities, no matter how much you want to get that documentation right, you can forget. There's so many edge cases that you might have to allow for. You could accidentally forget a critical piece of information that your mobile engineers would just need to know, or there might be no documentation at all. So we decided to invest some time to fix this problem. And here was our criteria for improvement. First, the API documentation cannot drift from the implementation. This was one of the most important criteria we wanted to improve on, because we wanted our API documentation and our API to be bound together in some way so that we can tell when it's starting to drift. Also, the availability of negative feedback in a test suite. So this is where we envisioned the API and the documentation really become bound together is in our test suite. So it'd be great to be able to test to see, is our documentation different from what the API is actually doing? And if it is, we want some kind of test to fail so that we know and we can go and fix that. And we wanted the tooling, that whatever this tool was, to be both client and server friendly. So we want to be able to provide better, more thorough documentation for our mobile engineers, but we also want our web devs to be able to actually write this without having friction and roadblocks. So we looked at a couple of different tools and we landed on Rswag. So what is Rswag? Rswag is a Ruby gem. I'm pretty sure you guessed that already. But it uses the Open API specification. And if you don't know what that is, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. It provides an interactive UI to view API documentation. And then it also generates that API documentation for you from specs. That's right. Specs that write documentation for you. And how this works is Rswag extends our spec rails. When you write an Rswag spec, you want to first aim at just getting them passing. And then once your specs are passing, you can swaggerize your specs, and Rswag will generate an Open API specification compliant schema. And that schema can be used for a wide variety of things. The GIF here that I have floating on the right hand of the slide, this is an example of what can be an outcome of that schema. This UI was generated from the schema, and this is an example of what we have in production for our telehealth APIs. And the way it does this is when you swaggerize those specs, they execute real HTTP requests and capture the responses and put it into the schema. So let's get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of how this works. So the Open API specification. So this is a standard language agnostic interface to RESTful APIs, which allow both humans and computers to discover and understand the capabilities of the service without access to source code, documentation, or through network traffic inspection. So this was all of those things, like looking through source code or through network traffic inspection. Like these were things that our mobile engineers had to do to figure out what was going on with our APIs before. Now they don't. And what this boils down to, the Open API specification, is you get the outcome is a JSON schema, or it could also be expressed as YAML. But all of your documentation is contained in a JSON schema. And the schema is based on this Open API specification standard, and it uses the same format as other APIs that use the Open API specification standard, which opens the door to using a lot of different tools for this. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. So I have a blog API, and that blog API has an articles controller. And I just want to look at a list of articles. So I have a get/articles API endpoint that returns a list of JSON articles. So that API returns something like this. Got an author, you've got a title, you've got a body, and a few other fields there. What this looks like when converted into an Open API specification compliant schema is you get this on the right-hand side. Now, this may seem a little text heavy, but stay with me. You can see that there's a path here, /articles, so that lines up with it. Get that HTTP method is the one that we're operating against, and the expected response for a 200. It's expected to return JSON, and here's an example of that. And you can see this example is the same thing as the example on the left, which is what your API is actually returning. This information is really valuable to your clients, and having it in your documentation, these examples of like a real life, what will be returned, is very valuable. So it may not look like much, but this little YAML or JSON file can do a lot. And there's more than it can do than just a Swagger UI, although a Swagger UI is very valuable. Like this is an example, that same Open API clip that I just showed you on the previous slide. This UI was generated from that YAML. But you can do a lot more than that. With this file, you can also generate mock servers. So the mock server will just be defined based on this schema, and you can hit it to the endpoints that are defined, expect a certain response back, and it'll provide the examples from your Open API spec here. So you could have a mock server respond to get articles, and it'll return this example. But you can also generate code based off of this. So, before the Open API specification, you would have to like manually write code to interact with these APIs all on your own. But you can actually pass this through a code generator, and it will just write Ruby code for you. And you could turn that into a gem or just place it into a lib, whatever makes the most sense. But that's not just restricted to Ruby. You can do it for really any other platform that you can think of, which is also fantastic for our mobile engineers, because they can now have something that will just generate the documentation for them that uses their API. So before I get into the details, let's talk a little bit about what the swag in Rswag actually is. So the swag stands for Swagger. I've got the link to swagger.io there at the bottom of the slide. Swagger had the original Swagger specification, and they then since have adopted the Open API specification, but they also provide a suite of open source tools where you can design APIs, which is great. You can just have a schema for an API that doesn't even exist yet. You can write and generate documentation, which is what we're doing with Rswag. You can display that documentation, which is also, you saw that UI, another thing that we're doing. And they also have a tool that will generate those clients and servers that we were just talking about. So let's see Rswag in action. I have a repository up on GitHub that's called rswag-blog-api, and it should be public. Go ahead and check it out. Go ahead and clone it locally, and you can do a little bit of follow along at home as I show you what Rswag can do. But you can try writing some tests and creating even more documentation around it. I don't have like a fully fleshed out request spec for this API. And it's really simple. It's just got like one article model and an articles controller. It's really stripped down. The most important part of it is just it has that Rswag integration that you can look at and play around with. And before I get into the demo, I want to talk about Rswag specs, because there is a little bit of a learning curve, and it doesn't quite follow RSpec specs the same way. So let's look at the anatomy of an Rswag spec. In order to get an Rswag spec to work, we need 4 components. First, we need to define the path. So in this case, this is an example straight from the code base that is up in GitHub that I just showed you a link to. So it's a /articles/ID. So this is the show action for a given article. And so that's the path that we're looking for. The second thing you need is the operation. So this is the HTTP method that you're using. It's compatible with get, post, put, patch, delete. Those are the ones we've used so far. So in this case, we are testing the get method of /articles/ID. The third thing you need is the expected response. So what are we testing here? What kind of conditions? Are we expecting a successful response, or are we expecting something like a 422 and a validation error? And then finally, and most importantly, we need to run the test. So run test actually tells Rswag to create and execute a corresponding example. So run test will execute this test, and it will first ensure that all of the criteria are met, so that that path articles ID exists, that it responds to get, and that response is a 200. And one thing that's nice here is that response 200. If that's different in any way, like even if it's a 201 instead of a 200, this spec will fail and the documentation will not be written to your schema. All right, so let's get into the demo here. All right, so you've seen this before. This is the exact same OpenAPI schema that I had in my slides. It's just a different color. And you can see here, we've got, so this is the index action that shows an array of articles. And you can see the attributes here. We've got author, title, and body. And I don't want to bury the lead anymore because I really want to show you the power of being able to automatically generate API documentation. So this whole document was automatically generated from Rswag specs. And I'm just going to take like a really quick look at this, but I don't have time to really dive into it. But that particular piece of documentation was generated from this Rswag spec. Here is a quick example. I don't want to go off the path too much. Here's an example of you can execute RSpec expectations within an Rswag test, which is also a really great feature. You get more bang for your buck out of that. But what I want to show you is adding an attribute. So I have an article JSON.jbuilder, and this is what outputs the JSON for a given article. And I'm going to add an attribute to this. I'm going to call it published, and I'm just going to hard code it to a Boolean value of true. So every time I use this API now, it's going to have JSON.published is true for every single entry. But the problem you run into here in real life is now you need to update your documentation because these two are now inconsistent. The JSON is actually returning an additional field, but our documentation doesn't have that field described in there, so nobody would know about it. The only thing you need to do, you don't even have to touch specs here. The only thing you need to do is run swaggerize. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this command here, and the command is rake rswag :specs :swaggerize, and there's a flag here that swagger dry run is equal to 0. By default, when you swaggerize, dry run is on so that it won't write to your schema file. In this case, I want the dry run to be off. I want it to write to my schema file. So we're going to go ahead and execute that. It'll execute those HTTP responses by running the tests. It writes them to my swagger.yaml file, which is my schema file. I have no failures, and that 6 examples, 0 failures, so that worked. And it should now be written in that file. So let's go ahead and refresh that here and take a look at this article again. Lo and behold, published true field is there. All we had to do was swaggerize, and it just did it all on its own. And the nice thing is, it's not just on this index action, it's also all throughout this entire documentation. So everywhere that you have an article rendering in JSON using that partial, published true has been tacked onto your documentation. This is really powerful. It works the same way when you remove fields. So if we go back and remove this published true and rerun swaggerize again, we go back and look for published true. It's not there anymore. So this is just fantastic. And it's really, really powerful. And there's so much more we could get into here, but I don't have the time to really dig into that. What I do want to take the rest of the time that I have to show you is the Swagger UI. And the Swagger UI has a lot of really great features. So this is all generated, like I said, from that schema. And you can see the schema here. There's a link, so you can look at the swagger.yaml. And yep, you've seen all this before. It's the same thing we were looking at in the IDE. And you can see the UI generated all of these endpoints here. And so you can look at the responses of GET, and this UI is what your engineers will be looking at, your clients will be looking at. In our case, our Android, Vue, iOS engineers are going to be using this, this UI, but it comes with a couple of cool features. So in this case, you can actually execute something against a server. You can actually exercise this API. So we've got a default host set here. My Ruby on Rails server is up and running at localhost 3000. And I'm going to just execute this get articles, get an index, and see all the articles that I have in my database. So the response provides you the curl request that it made and the request URL. And those are nice for like sanity checking to make sure all of this is working properly. And you also get a response body. In this case, I don't have anything, but that's expected. I don't have anything in my database yet. So let's go ahead and create something. And we can use Swagger to actually create a record. So let's try this out here. There's a request body, and I was able to construct this request body through writing a schema. And I don't have time to talk about schemas today, but there's an example in the Rswag spec if you want to take a look. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill these fields in here. And now that that's filled in, I'm going to go ahead and execute and create a record. And lo and behold, the response, it returns the very record that I wanted to create. Now, if we go back to that index action to get articles, and we try this out a second time, my article should now exist. So let's execute. There it is, an array, and this time it has an article in it. And it has a lot of other great features as well. So you can also edit this same article. So the, let's see, what was the ID? ID of 5. So I'm gonna update this record, and I'm just gonna go ahead and update the body of it. And let's just say foo, execute it. So it executed a put with those parameters, and the response is my article, but the body is now different. It now says foobar. That's exactly what we wanted. So you can do this with all of these endpoints, and all of your engineers can as well. Now, there's a lot more that I could get into that I just don't have time to talk about today. I'm already starting to get over time. There are more advanced features like schemas, which I only just barely mentioned, but you can do a lot like schema validation. You can make your tests fail if the JSON response is not in the exact structure that you expect it to be, which is really, really handy. And Rswag also handles authorization. So the UI does have a way to handle that. I glossed over that this time around as well, because I really wanted this application to be simple. But we do use the authorization part of Rswag for our documentation. So to sum all of this up, whether or not you use Rswag, although I would encourage you to try it out if you haven't yet, what I do want to convey and what I'd like you to take away from this is that your documentation can be automated, and it can save you a lot of time and heartache, and can also provide a better experience for your users and increase the adoption of these APIs that you're writing and this incredible code that you're writing. So thank you for your time. We do have a booth here if you're in person. Go ahead and check it out. We should have engineers and recruiters there, and it'd be great to get to talk to you. I am virtual, so I assume there's going to be some sort of chat ability at RubyConf. So please go ahead and DM me. And thank you very much. Also, we're hiring. So check out work@doximity.com if the things that we work on sound appealing to you, or if you'd like to work with somebody like me or the other engineers that we have at Doximity. And we have a wide variety of openings, all sorts of engineers, Ruby on Rails, site reliability, and mobile, and it would be great to have you. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of RubyConf.